always like to be prepared when I come and speak. Larry called me yesterday, so
Tons of notice.
I'll do the best I can. I noticed, even though the Civil War was 150 years ago, you still hear about it almost every day in the news. Trump gave a speech, I think February the 2nd, to a group of black people at the Black History Month, and he mentioned Frederick Douglass, who was a black abolitionist during the Civil War. Just this last week on the news, everybody probably here has heard about, I think it was in Virginia, didn't they take down a Robert E. Lee statue?
Charlottesville. Yeah, they voted to remove it against Virginia law.
Was it Virginia? Okay.
Yeah.
They want to take down a statue, rename the park. So, I mean, stuff like that is going on every day in the news. What they're trying to do is trying to erase Southern history, I mean, you even look at the Jews in Israel, they're saying, hey, the Jews have no connection to Israel. Well, there's a record. Over in Israel, they got an archaeological record. Every time they dig something up, they prove, hey, the Jews, were here. Same way with the Southerners. You can't, they might be able to take down a statue, but they can't erase Southern history. One of the things they can't erase is the photographic history. The Library of Congress is filled with photographs of black Confederates. And that's kind of a big topic to where, all those liberals, all those Northerners, they don't want to admit that they had black Confederates. But I know whenever I look at photographs, you look at photographs that say Union officers, and they're all sitting around, say a bunch of company officers sitting in front of their tent. If they have a black person, it's usually like a body servant, they call them, and he's standing in the back. But whenever they have a Southern black soldier, I mean, he's sitting right next to it like his white owner, You'll have a black Confederate, you have a white Confederate, he's got a musket in his hand, got his uniform on, got a Bowie knife stuck in his belt. Next to him, you got a black Confederate, you got a uniform on, got a musket in his hand, got a Bowie knife in his belt. They were black Confederate soldiers. They try to explain it away by saying, they just did menial work, they were teamsters, they were cooks. But you got the photographic history, that doesn't lie. You also have, written history. Talk about Frederick Douglass. One of the things he said during the Civil War, he said, there are at the present moment many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty not only as cooks, servants, and laborers, but real soldiers, having muskets on their shoulders and bullets in their pockets, ready to shoot down any loyal troops and do all that soldiers may do to destroy the federal government and build up that of the rebels. So you have a written history, even by someone from the North, who's saying, hey, there are, black Confederate soldiers. The war started in April 1861. 2 months later, in June of 1861, Tennessee became the first Southern state to use black soldiers. The governor was authorized to enroll those between the ages of 15 and 50 to be paid $18 a month and issued the same rations and clothing as white soldiers. So they were paid $18 a month. Some of the research I did about the pay during the Civil War period, usually guys made about $30 a month. They figured like $1 a day. If you made less than $1 a day, you were kind of scraping out a living. So anybody who's been in the military know you make less pay in the military than civilian. Okay? So the average pay was, say, $30 a month. Soldiers pay in the South, they paid them $18 a month. In the North, they paid a private $13 a month. The black Union soldiers, they paid them $10 a month. Okay? And they took $3 out of their pay a month to pay for clothing allowance. Now the Northern soldiers, they didn't take any money out of his pay. So he made $13 a month. Black soldier made $7 a month. So
that's nothing.
But in the South, they paid them equally. They gave them the same rations, Same uniform, same pay. You know, finding the blacks who served in combat units is not hard to find. They have a lot of researchers, historians here lately. They estimated there was between 15,000 and 120,000 black Confederates that served the South in combat or a direct combat role. Now, if you want to average that out, you figure there's probably about, they figure maybe approximate estimate about 65,000 black soldiers that served across the South. General Stonewall Jackson had 3,000 black Confederates in his corps. And a lot of times you'll read where Stonewall Jackson had 2 brigades of black soldiers. I just looked this up today. Nathan Bedford Forrest, who everybody said, oh, you know, he was the first leader of the Ku Klux Klan, you know, an anti-black organization. He had 7 black bodyguards, personal bodyguards in his unit.
He trusted him.
Yeah. Frederick Douglass, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, is supposed to free the slaves. Frederick Douglass, the people in the North didn't really have any love for slavery, okay? It wasn't, they were anti-slavery people. Frederick Douglass pressured Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because he didn't want the blacks to enlist in the Southern Army to fight against them. He didn't care if they were enslaved or not. He didn't want them fighting. As a matter of fact, like I said, this is also in the written record. Frederick Douglass warned the president that unless slaves were guaranteed freedom and land bounties, they would take up arms for the rebels. So he was saying, hey, if you offer them their freedom, give them land bounties out west, he said they won't fight. But that wasn't true. None of them turned their back on the South during the Civil War. I know I used to be a substitute teacher in the Independent School District. And when the kids get up to 5th grade, they would teach them a little bit about American history, Civil War. And they all knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'd tell them, I says, do you know how many people that Lincoln freed with the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, they didn't know. I said, well, I know the exact number. 0. Okay? He only freed the slaves that was in Southern control. He had no control over the South. He only freed them behind Southern lines. So, last year, in Virginia, they pulled a textbook off the shelves because the textbook was recording that they had black Confederates serving in the South. More recently, in North Carolina, a community turned down an effort to erect a monument to 10 black men who served in the Confederate Army and received pensions, because they didn't want a monument up there reminding everybody that there were black Confederates. Has been a few years back, I sent a donation in to the Museum of the Confederacy. And then right after that, they had a little bit of controversy. In their gift shop, they had little they had little toy soldiers. They were like little stuffed toys. One of them had a white Confederate soldier with a uniform on, and they had a black Confederate soldier with a uniform on. Well, somebody came in there and complained, and guess what they did? They pulled the little black Confederate soldiers off their shelves. This is in the Museum of the Confederacy. Well, I think I wrote them a letter, but I mean, you know, they kept asking me for donations, but they never got any more donations from me after that. And this, you know, this is stuff that goes on recently. You know, the Yankee historians are doing their best, like I said, to wipe out Southern history. And, you know, they can take statues down, you know, they can rename parks, they can do, you know, pull textbooks off the shelves. But really, it's groups like this, when you really think about it, I mean, when you talk to people one-on-one and tell them what actually happened in history and give them your references, you know, that's what really changes people's mind. You know, during the South, besides the black Confederate soldiers that was carrying muskets, they built bridges, they erected fortifications, they worked on docks. They offered really all kind of support, which was beneficial because the support that they rendered enabled those white soldiers to go off and fight and win those battles. You know, the blacks actually took their place. In the Southern capital, this was later on in the war, a quota was set for 300,000 black soldiers to fight for the Confederacy. 300,000. 83% of Richmond's male slave population volunteered for duty. Well, 83% out of 300,000, you're talking about 250,000 blacks volunteered to fight for the Confederacy. If you remember that movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick, they had a part in there to where, you know, they were revolting or mutinying or whatever because they weren't receiving the same pay as white troops. One of the things my wife and I like to do, we'd like to go down to Louisiana and go through all those old plantations. And I urge anybody to do that because they're full of history down there. They have this one place down there, it's called Nottoway Plantation. It's called the White House. Huge place, one of the largest plantations in Louisiana. It was built by a man by the name of Randolph. His relation is the same Randolph that's on the Declaration of Independence. Wow. He had slaves on his plantation. In 1850, they had electric lights at Nottoway Plantation. And you're thinking, you know, wait a second, you know, electric lights weren't invented then. They had acetylene lights. You ever see one of those acetylene torches, you know, cutting torch, whatever? They had acetylene lights in 1850 at this plantation. Now the person who mixed up that acetylene, the chemist that mixed all the chemicals and stuff so they could have electric lights, he was a black slave, worked on that plantation. Slaves on a plantation, all those plantations were self-sustaining. They didn't have a Walmart down the street. So everything they got on there, you know, the slaves had to provide. All they had was a white family. They had slaves. The slaves were veterinarians. They were wheelwrights. You know, they were leather workers. They were blacksmiths, you know, because we always think, okay, you had slaves, you had field hands, you had cooks in the house. They did all kind of work. After the Civil War, they were highly trained, you know, so they were able to find jobs after the Civil War. You go down to New Orleans in the French Quarter, and this even dates back to the French time, but you go down the French Quarter, you see all that wrought iron work on all those buildings. It was made by slaves. So they were highly trained craftsmen during the Civil War. Another thing about Nottoway Plantation, they had running water in their slave cabins. So, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there about how they treated slaves. They had laws on how they treated slaves. It went back to the French. It's called Code Noir. It was the black code. And there was laws how they treated slaves. You know, you just couldn't do anything you wanted to your slave. They have another plantation down there, the Rosedown Plantation. At one time, it was one of the most beautiful plantations down there. The front of Rosedown, they had a garden out there, like a shrub garden, rose garden, and it was patterned after the Garden of Versailles in France. Beautiful. Last few years, they sold it and turned it over to the state, Louisiana. They don't spend that much money on it, and it's all kind of grown up, and it's kind of sad now. But right outside this Rosedown Plantation, during the Civil War, there's a house right out front. As you go out the front door, it's like from here to the back wall there. Nice little house. Well, the guy who lived there had his wife and 3 children, had 3 daughters. That house was for a full-time doctor. He had a full-time doctor staying at that house. Well, that doctor wasn't just for him and his 3 kids. He had about 200 slaves. His slaves had a full-time doctor, okay? So, you know, the slaves were really well treated. They were given at least 2 sets of clothes a year, new clothes. They had full medical care. Under the codes of how to treat slaves, like when they got old and retired, it wasn't like, hey, you know, they patted them on the back and gave them a gold watch and sent them on their way. They were required to give them medical care until they died. So they even had Obamacare back then, I guess.
Nice.
But Jefferson Davis, when he had slaves, his wife personally sewed 2 sets of clothes a year for their slaves. And Jefferson Davis let his slaves govern themselves. So, you know, when somebody did something wrong, they set up a court. The slaves were the judge and the jury. The only thing Jefferson Davis didn't let them do, he didn't let them deal out punishment to them, corporal punishment. Jefferson Davis didn't deal out punishment, and he wouldn't let his slaves deal out punishment for each other. So slaves were, if you ever look up the history of how they treated slaves, it's a lot different than what is portrayed today. You know, you look at this part of the country, like when the Jayhawkers came over here, how they treated slaves. The normal routine when they came over here, they would round up all the slaves and force the slaves to go back into Kansas with them. So if a guy came over here on horseback, how much could he carry? If he rounded up 25 slaves, he could tell them, hey, go round up all the stuff, you know, that your owner has, loaded on wagons. So, you know, you took everything when you left. Every conveyance that they had, wagons, buggies, you name it, horses. They had all these slaves take it back to Kansas with them. Unfortunately, as soon as they got back to Kansas, somebody in another, you know, it's kind of like a graft thing, corrupt, they had another soldier walk up and they said, can you prove this property is yours? And they said, no. So they took all the property away from them and just kind of left them, you know, left them to go on their own. Lawrence, Kansas, like I said, the Union soldiers were making like $13 a month. Lawrence, Kansas, once they got slaves over there, freed slaves, they used them for household servants, for farmhands, and they were generous enough to pay them $1 a month in Lawrence, Kansas.
One step above slavery.
Yeah, so, and I'm sure they probably didn't give them free medical care on top of that. Once they took all the slaves back, once they raided the Missouri farms and plantations, most of the men were gone off to war, or else they were in a local guerrilla group. If you were an elderly person left there at home, gentlemen, if you showed any type of sympathy for the South, they'd just kill you. If you were younger, if you had a brother in the Army, father that was in the Army, they'd kill you too. It's on record they killed kids as young as 10 years old. Now, the women, some of the women they physically abused. Some of them they even raped. You ever heard about the Danville raid? Well, Bill Anderson went down there. Well, Bill Anderson wasn't at the Danville raid, but he sent a bunch of his men down there because it was in retaliation for a Union outfit down there that raped the Berry brothers' sisters who rode with Bill Anderson. So it was a retaliation. So they raped a lot of white women. When the Jayhawkers took over a farm, came on and raided a farm, if you were a black man and you didn't want to go with them, they'd either beat you or kill you. If you were a black woman and you didn't want to go, that's when they raped you in front of your owners. So it was a lot of atrocity. Proof of that, I mean, even General Halleck, who was in charge of all the Union Army at that time, he even wrote letters to Abraham Lincoln talking about all the rapes that the Union people were doing on the females. Mainly what I was going to talk about was, like I said, we were talking about black Confederates. There was a lot of blacks that served Quantrill during the war. Probably the most well-known was John T. Nolan. Matter of fact, I think John T. Nolan, I think he's buried up here. What's the cemetery on Nolan Road?
Yeah.
What's the name of that cemetery?
Woodlawn.
Woodlawn. I think he's buried up there. John T. Nolan. Once the Federals offered him $10,000 to betray Quantrill, and he didn't do it. Now, John T. Nolan was, during the first Battle of Independence in August of 1862, they said John Nolan crawled 200 yards under a withering fire to gather up a bunch of combustibles so they could go back and try to smoke Colonel Buell out of his headquarters building off the square. During the Battle of Lamar, Missouri, John T. Nolan was down there, and they said he was hollering out more orders than anybody down there, trying to get the Federals to think they were all surrounded. Another black man was John Lobb, rode with Quantrill. And we talk about we had you know, historical texts, historical record proving there were black Confederates. You had photographic history of provenance of blacks, Confederates. Anybody here that hadn't heard of the Canny Myers collection? He has a collection of photographs, blacks that rode with Quantrill. And he has a picture of John Law. And the date on the photograph is right before the Lawrence raid. Well, he sent John Law into Lawrence to spy out the town before he got there. He had another black with him that rode with him. It was Henry Wilson. Henry Wilson was one of those blacks that the Jayhawkers captured as they were raiding the farm, and they were taking him back to Lawrence, Kansas, and he managed to escape, and he ran back and joined Quantrill. Now, he served as one of Quantrill's mounted bodyguards. And you think, well, okay, maybe, you know, he really wasn't a black Confederate soldier. Well, Henry Wilson was wounded 7 times during the war. So you can, I don't think he would have been wounded as a cook. So you can take that for yourself.
He was fighting, yeah.
Yeah.
Unless the food was bad.
There's some more blacks that rode with Quantrill. There's a Jack Swartz. Jack Swartz was a mixed breed black man that rode with Quantrill on the Lawrence raid when he was only 16 years old. Well, Jack Swartz claimed that he carried the black flag into Lawrence. And everybody thinks, well, you know, maybe that was a made up story because there's some record that said, you know, they didn't carry a flag into Lawrence. Well, Jack Swartz said he did. And I even found, I think he died in Texas, they had an obituary where even Jack Swartz said he asked the closest person to him that when he died he wanted to be buried and have that black flag used as a shroud. Well, I think it says in the article they didn't use the black flag as a shroud. And I tried to track down the person that he had that request to, and I tracked that guy, and he was from Lawrence, Kansas. And I thought, well, you know, if I could find that black flag, that'd be like finding the Titanic.
Yeah.
So I did some checking. It threw me off base right off the bat because the guy that Jack Swartz names, he didn't have any male heirs. So it'd be almost impossible to try to track that down. So, but it may be out there somewhere. And you talk about photographic evidence. After I found that out, Emery Canny, in that Canny Myers collection he has of photographs, he found another picture of Jack Swartz. And he has a picture of Jack Swartz standing, and he's got the flag folded up in his hand.
Wow.
So a lot of times that photographic history proves a lot of things. Another thing, I think it was, it was by J.W., book by J.W. Buell, I think it was like 1908, it was The Outlaws of the Border or something like that. If that was the proper name. Anyway, it was mainly a story of Cole Younger's exploits that he told to Buell, who wrote the book. Well, one of the stories he mentioned in the book was a girl by the name of Annie Fickle. Her name was Ann, her middle initial was E, but they called her Annie Fickle. That one of the stories in there that Cole Younger said that she came into Quantrill's camp and brought the black flag and presented it to Quantrill, you know, and they mounted it on a pole, and Quantrill said, yeah, he'd use it. Well, a lot of people discounted that story because they couldn't really find a record of Annie Fickle, you know, like in the census record and stuff, so they thought, well, hey, this is one of those tall tales that Cole Younger was telling. Well, guess what? Her picture showed up in the Canny Myers collection.
Wow.
And the nice thing about the Canny Myers collection is that they're all identified in period ink on the photographs, plus there's a journal book that goes along with the pictures that they wrote, you know, stories about each one of those pictures, so it's 100% provenance. Another thing that that Canny Myers journal proves is one of the Yankee lies was during the Lawrence raid, one of Quantrill's men, his name was Charlie Higbee, and he was the treasurer for Quantrill. And he was supposed to have gotten out of Lawrence $75,000 out of the bank. Well, the Yankees said after the Lawrence raid, he absconded with the money and took off. Well, in the Canny Myers collection, it shows Charlie Higbee sitting around with a reunion with all the rest of Quantrill's men right after the war, so that disproved that one. Some other blacks that rode with Quantrill, you had a Frank Nolan. He was a black man for a time. He was a cook in the Confederate Army, but he came back to this area and he served as a cook with the Quantrill. He attended the Quantrill reunions. They had a black by the name of Zach Rube. He was Quantrill's personal cook all during the war. But the neat thing about it, even with this diversity, there's a lot of Indians that served with Quantrill. There was a Cherokee Indian named James Martin that rode with Quantrill on the Lawrence Raid. Another Cherokee Indian, his name was Ben Broomfield. He served under Quantrill and Captain Bill Anderson Company. Broomfield took part in the battles of Fayette, Centralia, the Danville Raid, and the Battle of Glasgow. He also fought in the Lawrence Raid. Broomfield was killed in action while saving the life of a fellow guerrilla, Plunk Murray. And this Plunk Murray rode with Quantrill. After the war, he became a Texas Ranger. Another Indian by the name of Cherokee Joe. Cherokee Joe is a Cherokee Indian. He was a scout that served under Quantrill. During one skirmish with the Federals, Cherokee Joe was killed, and the Federal who shot him was killed in return by Quantrill. Another Indian, his name was Solomon Strickland. He's also known as Red Fox. He was part Cherokee Indian. He served as an Indian scout under Quantrill, and he died in 1947 at 108 years old.
Wow.
And I think I did a newsletter article on Strickland. His life is kind of like a Forrest Gump type individual. As a matter of fact, even if you did a Google of Solomon Strickland, I mean, his life story is unbelievable. I mean, he says he had, lunch with President Grover Cleveland. He knew all the old outlaws on a first name basis, like Bat Masterson and all these guys. Like I said, his life was really, if you believe the story, it's like a Forrest Gump. Another Indian that rode with Quantrill, his name was Adam Wilson. He was Cherokee Indian that served as a scout for Quantrill. Another Indian, his name was Squirrel Tail. He was a Cherokee Indian that served as a scout with Quantrill. Had another Indian, his name was James Washington. They called him Wash. He was a half-breed Indian that served in Quantrill's company. While serving with the guerrillas in 1864, Washington was captured and he was executed by the Yankees for giving aid to the guerrillas. Now, the way I figure, during the Lawrence Raid, Quantrill assembled the largest group of guerrilla fighters ever known in history. He had 450 men with him. 50 of them were from Cass County. 100 of them were recruits they took with him on the Lawrence Raid. They were headed down to join with Price. So he actually had 300 men most of the time. Well, as many blacks and Indians that Quantrill had riding with him, I figure he had about 5% of his combat people were people of color, Indians and blacks. That was probably the most diverse military group during the Civil War. That's all I had. If anybody had any questions. Yes, sir.
I know, even not in the inner city, of course, but if you go out in rural areas, small towns like where I live, you talk to old established black families, and they will tell you stories like this. He's dead now. There's a dear old fellow I used to visit with up at home. Sometimes I'd catch him out on the front porch and I was walking by, and I'd stop and talk to him, and he'd tell me stories. And he said back during the war, he had relatives that worked on a farm over in Platte County. And he said the Union troops rode in. They took the black family's young girl with them, and they never saw her again. Lord knows what happened to her. They weren't there to liberate them. But they will tell you stories like that. They can still today tell a lot of interesting stories about what went on that's been handed down through the oral tradition in their families.
I was talking to Larry yesterday when he called me so late.
Very early.
I moved to Holden, Missouri, and I went in the post office, and they have a plaque on the wall of all the early postmasters. And there was a person on the wall, his name was Rennick. And I'm thinking, okay, wait a second, Rennick. Well, Chatham Rennick was one of Quantrill's men, went to Kentucky with him. He was killed in Kentucky. So I go back and I do some checking. Well, the Rennick that was a postmaster in Holden, Missouri, right after the Civil War, was Chatham Rennick's father. And there's still Rennick's down there, about halfway in Holden, not very big. They've got a little place where, I don't know, they have like a little memorial set up or something, and they've got a brick path, and they got names on the bricks. I guess you can pay to put names. Well, there's Rennick's names on this brick path that somebody has put down. Plus, there was a guy down there during the campaign season. Gosh, it was, I went up to Warrensburg with the grandkids because they were doing Halloweening on the main street. And there was a guy up there that was state representative. His name was Howe, I think, how you pronounce it, H-O-U-X. And I remember there was Hughes that rode with Quantrill. I know there was one guy, Matthew Morningside Ho. He had a brother. Anyway, so I asked this guy, I said, you know, do you have any relatives that rode with Quantrill? Oh, yeah, you know. So you get down in some of these rural areas and you meet all kind of people. The guy that just poured my foundation was telling me, he's a concrete guy, and he said there's some farm down there in Holden where there's a cave. And he says on the outside of this cave, you know, all these guys have written their names, you know, carved their names in the limestone rock. And this dates back to the Civil War period. I said, oh man, I said, can you get me some of these names? It's on private property. I said, I'd love to find some of those names because you can imagine, you know, some of the guerrillas may have hid in that cave and carved their names on the outside. So there's a lot of history in, you know, some of these towns. There's a lot of history everywhere, as a matter of fact, in this area. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You can tell them what you were telling me about that town fair. That might not be a bad place to
you
set
know,
up in.
I ran a copy, and I guess it didn't get on my sheets that I brought with me. But I think it's in August every year. They have a Holden Town Fair. It's what they call a street fair. Got the carnival on the side streets. They've got, you know, music and the dance and the parade and stuff. But I mean, that'd be a great idea to put up a booth down there. I keep thinking, I said, hey, I'm going to see the SCV group down here sometime. I never have. Matter of fact, they had a guy with a booth that was selling, you know, Confederate memorabilia down there.
We'll go down there, I got cousins in Walden.
Okay, I mean, I could call City Hall and ask them how much a booth is. I'm sure it's not much, but I think it'd be a great area. Like I said, there's all kind of Quantrill people down there. As a matter of fact, 4th of July, I think the kid's probably a senior in high school or something. He drives his truck through town doing the 4th of July deal. He's got an American flag and he's got a big, huge Confederate flag on his truck, you know, flying around town.
Nice.
As a matter of fact, I don't know, it was 6 months or so ago when the, you know, the political stuff was going on, and I drove up to Windsor, Missouri, and just driving out in the country that way, I haven't seen so many Confederate flags in my life. Just, you know, people, you know, in the front yards everywhere down there. As a matter of fact, when I get my house finished, I'm putting the flagpole up out
Running
in my
the
yard.
flag up.
Yeah, so. Cool. Anyway, I think it'd be a good area for the SCV. You know, you can try it one year, see what happens. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Awesome.